It was a scream that had no place in the ordered dark of Fazenda Santa Luzia, a single raw sound that tore the night open and left the farm holding its breath. Dogs answered with thin yelps. The lamparinas inside the senzala and the Casa Grande flickered as if touched by the same wind. Men on the porch spat tobacco and listened. Women tightened shawls around their shoulders and waited for the first footsteps to tell them whether this was an accident, a quarrel, or something worse. The moon did not rise that night. The sky was a black, heavy bowl, and the scream sank into it until the sound grew small and then stopped, as though someone had found a hand to cover a mouth. Fazenda Santa Luzia had the neat certainties of a small world. Rows of manioc and maize, a narrow lane that ran from the gate to the Casa Grande, a yard where chickens scratched in the dust, and a hierarchy that sat like a visible architecture, Donna Mariana's shadow at its highest point, the capataz with his practiced imperiousness, merchants whose sacks of cloth and sugar left a trail of new gossip, and the laboring hands that made the place live. Isabel moved through that order with a careful economy. She kept one foot on the tasks that fed the household, and the other slightly turned toward the forest at the property's edge, where she read seasons in leaf and root. Everyone noticed her hands, calloused but deft, fingers that knew the names of plants by smell and by the unspoken logic of when to take and when to leave the earth to itself. Anna was Isabel's daughter, no more than 17 and carrying the fine, quick bones of someone who had learned to make less of herself than the world expected. She had been born in the shade of a jenipapo tree, the midwives said, which made the older women fond of saying that she and the tree belonged to one another. Anna moved with a watchfulness that came partly from living where eyes were always watching, where rumor could be as dangerous as hunger. She liked the merchant's bright ribbons when he came through the gate. She liked the way the cheap silk shimmered and promised more than it could give. That momentary pleasure would be the match later, petty, human, and devastating. Donna Mariana kept the house like a small kingdom. Her dresses were plain but impeccably kept, her voice a measured instrument of command. She did not need to shout. People complied, because it cost less breath to obey than to resist. The capataz improved the economy of threat, a man whose bark and look kept rows of men moving the way he desired. He enforced the rules the overseers drew up, which were less written laws than a practice of power. Who swept at dawn, who passed the salt, how humiliation could be given as correction and made to look like necessity. The merchant arrived with bolts of cloth and an appetite for small gossip. His smile was practiced, his packs heavy with the colors that caused a stir among women who made their wardrobes from modest means. He planted new threads of desire in heads already full of tasks. There was no malice in his offering. Desire does not require malice to be dangerous. A word here, a look there, and whispers rose like steam in the yard, filling corners where truth might later fester. The punishment occurred in the midday light, under the gaze of a dozen bodies that had come to watch any order enforced, to confirm that the world remained right. Anna had been caught with a scrap of cloth not meant for her, an offense that in that moment bent and twisted into a spectacle. The capataz pronounced the punishment with a voice that wanted to be unmitigated, birching, a command to perform public shaming that would make other hands think twice. Donna Mariana watched with a face carved of calm. Isabel stood among the crowd like a tree with roots pulled up, immobile and then, trying to be invisible, stepping closer the moment furred breath escaped her daughter's lips. Anna's cry when the punishment came was a sound not merely of pain but of humiliation, of a girl suddenly forced into the size of a scandal. The yard learned her name differently that day. The word shame was stitched to her like a mark. Afterwards, she was feverish. The fever had the wet feeling of a thing that comes from too much sun and too many anxieties, from a wound in the soul as much as in the skin. She lay in Isabel's small room with the lamparina low, muttering fragments and names that did not belong to the day. The village curandero, a man who did what he could with leaves and prayers and the limits of his knowledge, offered tinctures that cooled and reddened by turns. He tapped the pulse, said the old prayers, and when he left he did so with the kind of gravity reserved for those moments when healing depends on more than remedies. It was under the jenipapo that Isabel made her promise. The tree's trunk was a twisted thing, older than anyone in the immediate generation, its fruit sticky and sour when ripe. People passed it without much thought. Children used it as a place to hide. Lovers met in its thick shade. That afternoon, Isabel walked to it with her daughter's hair in her hands and a cloth with the curandero's notes folded in a pocket. A small crowd gathered as if to confirm shadows. The roosters paused. The washerwoman stopped her beating. Even the merchant lingered by the fence. Isabel's voice in those minutes was not loud, but it carried. She said things that were half prayer and half promise. If Anna lived, she would give thanks and tend the land that had kept them. If Anna died, there would be an answer, and that answer would not be the end of the story. Someone gasped. Some shifted away. The capataz's eyes narrowed, not at the words themselves, but at the fact that a promise had been made aloud, in a place visible to everyone. To say such a thing in public was to set a clock. Vows heard by witnesses tend to settle into the world with a stubbornness of their own. Anna did not die. The fever retreated like a bad tide. Days later she opened her eyes and they looked at the room where Isabel had kept watch. Relief moved through the household like a quiet rain. But promises do not evaporate with passing storms. The vow at the Genipapo sank into Isabel's bones and hardened into something else. It did not become spite, exactly. It became a patient plan. She did not speak of revenge, the women said later. She spoke of patience. That is what patience looks like when it is sharpened by love's fear. Months unfurled into years. Time in the forest has its own curriculum. Isabel, who had always taken and given from the land, learned other lessons too. The timing of predators, the ways animals moved when nights were dark and when crops were full, which roots drew the animal's attention and which leaves masked human scent. She watched without ostentation. Where others saw mere wilderness, she read a long living ledger. Rainfall, rodent trails, bird migration. She made friends with small knowledge, which bark peeled at the right angle to make a seal, how a certain insect's chorus changed with the moon. This was not a feverish apprenticeship in cunning. It was the development of a kind of craft, of domestic cunning, married to ecological intelligence. The curandero played a quiet role in this time, less magician than witness. He had not performed miracles that winter, but he shared a word here and a method there, always careful to avoid promises beyond his art. People would later tell the story with different emphases. Some said Isabel had a secret teacher. Others said the forest itself instructed her. The truth sat somewhere between the two. Knowledge gathered close, practiced with the small instruments of household life, and then kept folded, like laundry, until required. Isabel's plan was not a single night's desperation. It was a patient architectural thing, observing the house, learning the cadence of Donna Mariana's routines, understanding the capataz's breath and the merchant's comings, seeing where doors were left unlatched and where a shadow could lengthen without being noticed. She practiced walking at times when the animals were busy and when the moon was only a suggestion. She made small tools and hid them among the things nobody would think to examine. It was the work of a person who had once tended wounds and now tended the space where a wound might be offered back. She thought of the Genipapo and the vow like a compass. She kept it steady, never allowing the tilt of impatience. When people talk of such long plots, they often imagine theatrics, a sudden violent burst. But real plans are quieter, made of repetition and measurement. She tested doors at dusk. She watched how the lamparinas swayed in the room where Donna Mariana read letters from distant relatives. She listened to the capataz's breathing on nights when he slept near the house, feet too used to wooden floors to be silent. She waited for the moonless nights, the ones where even the river did not catch light. The jararakusu, a snake shapely and silent in the undergrowth, was a motif in the village stories about fate. Isabel thought of it as an emblem of patience, a creature that moves when the moment is right. She never spoke of putting any creature in harm's way to others. She spoke of timing, of knowledge, of the hush that makes act possible, and public fuss unlikely. The night chosen was the kind of dark that wore its silence with dignity. It was 1842. Winter had thinned the air and left a certain bitter sweetness in the coffee jars. Isabel walked across the yard with a shawl about her shoulders and a small bundle at her side. The house smelled of wood smoke and the last of the stew. Inside, Donna Mariana read until her eyes fell heavy. The capataz drank in the back room and assumed his sleep. The merchant's cart had left the week before, his bright cloths already folded into other hands. No one expected trouble. After all, what could one worker woman do against the machine of a manor? Isabel moved like someone who had learned to read shadow as letter and letter as sentence. She did not hurry. She did not shout. She did not carry a proclamation. She opened a door. She stepped into a passage where the floor made a particular creak. She placed things where they needed to be and did not look at the sleeping face that had humiliated her child. There was a sound, like the closing of a book. There was a suddenness to what followed, but it was the result of long preparation, measures taken so carefully that in the telling the act will sound instantaneous and therefore inevitable. The house woke in a different way. A small light shift here, a startled breath there. People smelled smoke and commotion, and then silence where silence had not belonged. Neighbors came in their nightshirts and lanterns. The capataz barked orders that meant little against the raw fact. Donna Mariana was found. The body lay as bodies lie when the world is abruptly altered. The town felt it as if a roof had been removed and the weather rushed in. The word death unfastened itself and hung in the yard like a bad weather sign. No one saw Isabel walk away. She had already dissolved into the dark, the shawl around her shoulders catching the air as she moved toward the Genipapo. She went to the tree and stood with her palm flat against the rough bark, as if to reassure herself that the tree still held. She made no speech that night. The promise she had made years before had been kept, but she did not celebrate. There was no triumph in her face, only the old weary lines of a woman who had done what she believed necessary and whose hands trembled with the knowledge of it. What followed belonged to a village learning to cope. Stories multiplied like currents. Some said it was divine retribution, that the kind of injustice a master dispenses had called for a higher balance, and God had dispatched his own. Others said it was a stranger, a highwayman, a misfortune. Some inclined toward a tale that softened their responsibility. Donna Mariana had perhaps choked on a bone, they murmured, or had been felled by an old ailment. A few whispered in corners with hands over mouths, said that Isabel had done it. Those who believed the last version were a quiet, dangerous minority. To speak the possibility aloud ran the risk of confronting a truth that required action. And who wanted to invite the capataz's ire, the mistress's relative's judgment, or the magistrate's attention? There was an inquiry of sorts, a perfunctory scratching at the surface that left the deeper currents undisturbed. Officials visited from the nearest town and asked questions wrapped in official form. They took statements written with careful hands. Some men who had seen Isabel near the Genipapo the night before offered their testimony and then seemed to vanish from the list of useful witnesses, as if the cost of staying honest had become too heavy. The capataz swore he had been asleep. The merchant had been at his stall miles away. The curandero shrugged at rumors and shook his head with the weary endurance of someone who knew that people preferred peace over the exacting weight of truth. The village chose the story it could live with. It was easier for most to accept misfortune than to believe a woman like Isabel could unmake the house. People formed protective myths. The world of power, they said, could be undone by fate as much as by people. If someone had wronged, perhaps fate had struck. Rumor does a particular economy. It preserves the social fabric by finding the least expensive way to account for harm. To name Isabel would have been to name a motive they could not unname. To avoid naming her preserved the balance within the community, awkward and imperfect, but at least intact enough to continue dawn tasks. Isabel bore the aftermath in ways no public inquiry could legislate. She did not flee. She continued to tend the garden, to mend shirts, to advise Anna on when the rainy season would ruin the corn. She walked with the stooping grace of someone pressed on by time and consequence. Sometimes she woke in the night with hands clenched and blood pounding in her ears, remembering the feel of the door and the silence that followed. Sometimes she felt a lightness that surprised her, a release as if a weight had been lifted. She fed both feelings into her days without declaring which one was truer. She had protected her daughter, and protection has a ledger of debts. Anna grew. There was a steadiness to her that made people say she had been tempered in the fire. She learned to read small things, the language of the market, the way a man's eyes shifted when he lied, the pattern of rain clouds that would mean bad harvest. She took on tasks that allowed her to stand with dignity in a world that earlier had tried to bind her. In time, she married a man who respected her work and gave her room to cultivate a little plot of land with beans and peppers. She became known for quiet competence, for a face that had once been marked by humiliation but no longer showed it. The Genipapo remained her silent witness. She would sometimes sit beneath it and trace the bark with fingers that remembered. Years passed. Children were born who learned the story in fragments. Isabel's voice telling the tale became a ritual, less about the facts and more about the shape of what it meant to survive. She did not tell the tale to boast. She did not tell it to solicit condemnation. She told it as one might explain how a house keeps warm through a long winter, small practicalities wrapped in a human narrative. She spoke of the Genipapo as witness. She named the Jararakusu in a way that suggested both respect and the careful distance one keeps from anything that might bite. People in the village debated in quieter voices over cups of coffee and at the well. Some admired Isabel's courage, others feared that such acts eroded order, that if everyone took matters into their own hands, the fragile peace of the comarca might fragment. The Capataz's grandchildren grew up without the clarity of what had been done that night. They accepted the official account and fed it to their children. The merchant continued to trade, adjusting prices with the seasons. A new generation added layers of interpretation. Some spiritualized the event into a parable about justice. Others stripped it of moral content and told it as a story of survival. Isabel aged with the sort of dignity one sees in people who have carried something heavy for a long time. Not stoic, so much as weathered, face lined by sun and decision. Her hands betrayed the decades of work, and a small wound she would occasionally press and recall by look rather than speech. She sat at the doorstep more often, watching the new children chase the chickens, letting the sun warm her knees. The Genipapo, which had once been a mere tree for shade and fruit, was now a living ledger of their lives. Children climbed its low branches and returned with stories their mothers knew to edit. Visitors came in from other districts and were told the versions that fit their ears. The past was negotiated daily because memory demands that a community decide which version of itself to carry forward. In winter, when the nights lengthened and conversation took on a metaphysical slant, Isabel would sometimes speak plainly to the small assembly that came to sit at her feet. "I promised at the tree," she would say. Then she would look at Anna, who sat with children around her, her hands busy with embroidery. "I kept my promise. I would do it again to protect her." There were audible gasps or a look of rueful understanding. "Would you?" people asked in the silence that followed, not to demand an answer, but to place the question into the world like a stone dropped into dark water. When a mother makes a vow in public to protect a child, what can that justify? That question hung in the air like smoke, and the village did not answer it with a single voice because the answer demanded action, legal, moral, and social, that would not fit easily into the existing order. Some said the mother's vow sanctified any measure she took. Others argued that vows do not suspend law, they do not alter the consequences of taking another life. Isabel lived with both statements pressing at her ribs. She had acted out of desperation and calculation. She had used knowledge of the land and its patterns to alter a dangerous balance. She had done harm and created safety in the same motion. There is no tidy verdict for such a life. Decades later, when Anna's children would play beneath the Genipapo and the grandchildren would ask about the woman whose hands stitched the stories, Isabel would sit and make a small, private smile that suggested both regret and resolve. "Ask me what you wish," she would say, "and I will answer as a mother does, with what I knew and with what I feared." She would take out small seeds and show a child how to plant them in a patch of earth. The gesture was simple: care for the living. Rumor softened into something like legend. Outsiders came to Santa Luzia with the appetite for moral tales, hungry for a heroine or for a villain. The village merchants sold trinkets that alluded to the Genipapo. The tale of the night became a way to attract the curious. People adjusted to the ambiguity because ambiguity is a shelter. It allows a community to acknowledge harm without necessarily indicting itself. It allows people to believe either that fate had its hand in things or that one mother had risen to the extreme of defending her child. Isabel was neither absolved nor condemned by her people. She carried the weight the way one carries a basket too full for one arm, with care and a sort of resigned skill. She did not confess in any official sense. She did not boast. She would sometimes tell the story differently for different ears. To her grandchildren she told the version with more tenderness. To the village youth she allowed a harder edge. She never gave a sermon about justice, only the small, steady recounting of choices, motives, and consequences. This was her way of teaching that the world is made of choices like that, small and bitter, baked into the daily loaf. Years layered like sediment. The landscape shifted with each rainfall. The Genipapo grew a little more knotted. New houses rose on the edges. The capataz died of an illness that took him in a week. The merchants' sons left the trade for towns filled with factories. Anna's children married and moved to places with different expectations. People reconfigured their lives around the possibilities the farm offered and the stories it held. Sometimes on a bright afternoon that smelled like clean laundry and boiled cassava, people would gather near the Genipapo to hear Isabel speak. She would tell them about the scream that had opened the night, about the sound that set everything into new motion. She would describe not the act in the kind of detail that feed gossip, but the months of patient watching, the small practices that made the night into something that could be enacted without dragging the entire village into the center of a scandal. She said these things not to justify herself, but to offer the texture of what had occurred, because texture is closer to truth than a single moral label. The final scene of her life was not theatrical. She sat under the Genipapo with Anna at her side, the two of them part of a quiet, domestic tableau. The tree had done what trees do. It had borne fruit, offered shade, held the marks of names carved by boys who were now grown, and had become a living witness to a story the village never fully resolved. Isabel pressed her palm to the bark and felt the familiar ridges. She thought of all the small choices that add up to a life, and did not expect to be forgiven by a world that keeps its ledger both for saints and sinners. She watched children chase chickens and felt both joy and an ache that never fully left her. To do nothing can be an action, she said once to a young woman who asked whether she had thought of turning herself in. To hold your tongue can be a way of keeping a house from burning. To speak can be a way of setting a different fire. Which is the braver course? It was the kind of question that has no one right answer. In the end, the Genipapo was what remained most constant. A witness that could not testify in a court, but could hold the memory of those who passed beneath it. It had seen a promise made, a promise kept, and a life reshaped by the cost of that keeping. Isabel's name persisted as a complicated thing in the village, spoken sometimes with respect, sometimes with fear, sometimes with the fondness people reserve for those who have saved a life and then become, in others' view, a dangerous model for private righteousness. And the Jararakusu, that snake known for its patient waiting, lived on in the village lore. Children were told to respect its quiet, to not startle it. It became a shorthand in adult talk. Someone who is like a Jararakusu is a person who waits and moves when the time is right. Few outside Santa Lucia could understand the way Isabel used that analogy in her own life, not as a boast of cunning, but as a statement of the unromantic reality of guardianship, that sometimes protection demands acts that unsettle the moral ledger. When the last days neared, Isabel sat beneath the tree and asked the hard questions aloud, for there was no one to answer them with the authority she wanted. Did a mother's protection absolve her? Did love ever justify what it demands? The Genipapo offered no response. The village offered a chorus of partial answers. The curandero, older now and slower, came to sit with her and said, "The law of the land is not the law of the heart." That was as close to a verdict as anyone offered. She died with her hand in Anna's, not with grand speeches, but with the small grace of a woman who had kept a promise that changed lives. She left behind a community that would argue about her in kitchen corners and at the well. She left behind a daughter who had learned, in the cost of her protection, the weight of choice. She left the Genipapo, which remained stubborn as the earth itself, and the memory of a scream on a moonless night that shifted the parish into new shapes. You are left with the question, as those who heard the tale in Santa Lucia were left. When the architecture of power preys on the vulnerable, when a mother sees no lawful means to protect her child, what does justice look like? Is it the law's measured hand, or the private reckoning of a human heart? The story offers no tidy answer, only the evidence of lives altered, and a community learning to live with the consequences. If this story touched you and you want more untold tales of old Brazil, subscribe. If you're unsettled, if you carry an image of the Genipapo or the Jararacusu in your mind, write snakes in the comments and tell us what you think. Subscribe to hear more stories that live in the spaces between right and wrong, where people must choose and then live with what those choices cost.